is this, yeah, this works. Okay, so I'm Alex, you can see my full name on the screen, and I'm going to talk about evidence, which is a topic that I've kind of started discussing and working on with my advisor, Stephen, and both of us at UCL. So evidence is kind of a pretty general term. It comes up in a lot of situations. There's a couple keywords you can see on the slide now. And you have kind of like the lawful definition of evidence, where obviously you're familiar with court cases, people bring in evidence to try and convince a judge and so on. And even here we've had some discussions about things like non-repudiation, or rather like having repudiation in some cases. Being able to verify evidence is kind of verifying proofs is a common cryptographic thing, integrity of data and so on. And there's even, I snuck in some small kind of like Bayesian idea of evidence with, probabilities if P of A given E is bigger than P of A, then E is evidence for A. There's kind of a lot of different notions going on. So, for a bit of background, we'll start with the general idea of a system. Have a big system, you've got a lot of protocols going on, a lot of people operating in different parts of the protocols. There's some kind of set of rules that are more or less agreed upon of how the system should run. And a lot of it, everything in there can pretty much fail. Computers fail all the time, humans fail all the time, rules are, can be pretty bad and written by people who don't understand the system. And especially the standard idea of security is that you'll kind of like have some security guarantees for some like well-defined functionalities of the system. You try and control kind of information flow in the system, access control and so on. But for a lot of large-scale kind of modern systems, there has to be a certain level of openness and allowing people to kind of do more or less what they want with some freedom. Which is kind of leads to a lot of problems that we have. So, everything that can go wrong will probably eventually go wrong in whatever you're doing. I'm sure everyone here has experienced that in their work. And so, you have kind of how do you deal with things going wrong? And there's a pretty common notion for things like distributed systems of, fail-safes and fail-deadly, which are the two sides of the same coin, where you want to make sure that if something fails, the people that didn't cause it to fail shouldn't suffer too much. And on the other hand, the people that did cause it to fail should kind of bear the cost. And you want to make sure that, that kind of disincentivizes them from making things fail or kind of cutting costs for negative effects that affect other people. And that relates to the notion of accountability, wanting to make sure that people are accountable for what they do and that things kind of run smoothly when they can't just be constrained. So that's, situations like that, you want, a lot of parties that can do pretty much whatever they want. In your personal life, you might have encountered this if you have kids. Maybe you have to deal with kind of law enforcement, mass surveillance, accessing your data and so on. It's hard to always kind of, stop them from doing whatever you don't want to do them. They have pretty vague notions of responsibility. And of course, for accountability, you need some party that will kind of come into play and say, okay, you're accountable for this, and actually enforce, whatever punishment has to go on. So, I've talked a bit about kind of evidence as a pretty general topic, and I'll keep it as a pretty general topic for the purpose of this talk. It's anything that you want to use to kind of hold people accountable in the broad sense of the word. You're kind of free to pick and choose an example in your mind that you like, and then kind of keep it in mind during the rest of the talk, and hopefully it will kind of make sense, as I'll try and keep it pretty general. But there's, maybe two cases that we can kind of distinguish, which is one where you have security failures, which is usually a protocol failing and so on, or a bit more of, from the privacy point of view, it's usually kind of like violating privacy policies and things like that. So some examples for a bit more of a security perspective, kind of payment systems. There's a FC 2014 paper by Stephen about this, the lack of evidence in payment systems and being unable to kind of deal with failures in a way that holds the right party liable. And from a more kind of privacy and policy point of view, things like access to data, where data is shared and accessed in many, many ways. And we did some work on this, which is kind of plugged over here, about obviously if you can't just stop people from accessing data has to be shared at some point. But you want to make sure that if they access it, you have some evidence that it was accessed, and you can more or less hold them accountable if something goes wrong down the line. And it's kind of embraced as well on kind of both sides of the debate. So Ian Levy, which is technical director at the NCSC, which is the public-facing branch of GCHQ in the UK, said himself that he wants to see kind of more evidence and openness in the kind of privacy debate about access to data. Obviously, when I asked him what he meant by evidence, he said, I don't know. But this is how it is. And I'll put a third example there: cryptocurrencies, which are they are what they are. But it's a good example of a fairly kind of open system which aims to, kind of keep people honest, more or less. Inside it, using evidence as, the idea is you can obviously go and replay the whole blockchain, however unrealistic that is. And again, kind of, if you have an example in mind that you want to go along with for the purpose of the talk, then, feel free. It's a pretty broad topic, and I think for most areas you can probably think of something relevant. So I'll go over kind of three main open questions that I think are pretty important, which is first, how are we kind of going to deal with the rule of evidence in a sensible way? So what's a good model to kind of approach the question? How should evidence be produced? There's obviously kind of the cryptographic idea of we want, really high quality evidence that has very strong guarantees and so on. And then, what form should the evidence take, which is a bit more tricky as, that depends on who you're going to present the evidence to. And so this is more or less what I'm going to talk about, and that, can be good topics of discussion at the end. So we're going to start off with, kind of the idea of what's a basic threat model to go with. And so this is where we kind of differ from the usual approach, where we're allowing parties to have a lot of freedom. So instead of having an adversary that does such and has specific functions that you want to kind of try and constrain with some cryptographic protocol, here your adversary is someone that's just a participant in the system, which you're fine with, but they can do more or less whatever they want, and so something might go wrong. And so there's usually the idea here of an honest participant, which is that they're going to behave in some way which you have more or less defined as, they're going to perform some fairly idealized functionality in the system. That has some realistic deviation, but also you don't want them to deviate too much, otherwise that's when things start to go wrong. And so that's the goal, which is going to be to kind of evaluate more or less, whether they're deviating too much for whatever rules you've defined, and then being able to deal with that, and basically holding them accountable. So the usual standard way of dealing with people's behavior is things like game theory, and you want some equilibrium where people don't do bad things, which is a fairly standard concept. Everyone here will be familiar with it, but doing it in a lot of systems is actually pretty tricky. Standard game theory doesn't take into account the cost of actually doing things. If you want to hold someone accountable and do an order system, that actually isn't cheap. If the computational cost of trying to cheat at something is much lower than the computational cost of actually verifying that someone has cheated, then you have some tricky things to start to go on, and you might end up with a situation that you don't really like. And similarly for kind of more open systems where people can come and go as they want, dealing with kind of games that have an unknown participants is pretty non-trivial as well, and hasn't really been solved to a large extent. And as well, the system evolves with time. It's not kind of you're not just replaying the same thing over and over again. You have different actions. Even evidence that gets added to the system and produced by the system kind of changes people's ideas of, maybe their distribution of what they think the distribution of player types are and so on. And, this is actually a genuine problem where, again, this is maybe more on the cryptocurrency side of things, where people have started to try and prove things like Nash equilibrium and so on. And it ends up being more or less nonsense in the sense that their assumptions just don't actually work for something like a Nash equilibrium. So there's one possible approach which is along the more sensible side, which is Bayesian machine games, which is used to Halpern and Pass, which are both at Cornell. And their idea is you have a Bayesian game, which is a game of incomplete information. You have a distribution of things like player types and machine types, but they also they have a complexity function, and they kind of more or less take into account how expensive it is to kind of do things in the system. But it's, they have a framework. They don't really have kind of very good rigorous examples that are actually applicable in a decent sense, rather than just some equivalences between games and cryptographic security notions. So that's maybe an interesting thing to take into account and try and solve. And then you get to kind of, assuming you have evidence here, it's also what are your basic principles and kind of reasonable things to expect. And obviously you want evidence about things that happen in the system, so if something fails in the system, the evidence production should obviously not fail. This one is pretty straightforward. Reliability, you want to make sure that you're actually going to enable the correct decision to be made with evidence. So for one, it means you need an actual definition of what your decision mechanism is, whether it's to trust a third party that obeys some kind of rules or a consensus mechanism. And genuinely kind of, you're not going to make someone liable if they're not, and someone that is liable shouldn't not be made not liable. Robustness, you want evidence to be kind of good. This is a fairly cryptographic fairly simple cryptographic idea. It should be kind of tamper resistant. And also retention, which is more or less, a bit maybe like rarely addressed compared to the above, where if you want to have evidence that's long term, how you're going to ensure that it actually it's retained properly, but also is actually going to be worth something in a long time. If your evidence now is some kind of MD5 hash, it's probably not that reliable. And so how do you kind of look at producing evidence like that? So you have, a good simple way is maybe logging actions in the system, and you have things like, Merkle trees or things based on that, like blockchains and Trillion, which is a big Merkle tree invented by Google. That can give you like a tamper evident log of events, but it's fairly limited as far as you can log events, but you don't have much verification going on, and you're kind of assuming people are actually going to log things themselves. I don't know if there's an automatic way of actually logging things in a sensible manner. Verifiable computations, that's an existing cryptographic thing. It works pretty well to some extent. There's a lot of literature about it, but that's good for verifying like actual computations. What do you have to do if you have to deal with someone claims they made a decision? It's a bit trickier, and probably you can't just generalize it that way. And similarly, maybe verifying like adherence to some like vague rules, like law which is intentionally vague, you might not be able to do in like a purely algorithmic way like this, or purely cryptographic way. So that's has a lot of its limits. Proof of X, kind of similar, and I'm not talking about just things like proof of work for like whatever. I'm saying proof of retrievability, proofs of space. They're all pretty useful, but they're all pretty task specific, and without going even into things like efficiency, they're not very general. So how do you actually what are the best ways of kind of going about and actually putting an evidence production system on top of your existing system that is fairly general and fits your system is pretty non-trivial thing. And then presenting evidence, again, we're going a step further and assuming that you've got your evidence production sorted out. How do you make sure that it's actually reasonably useful? You've got kind of 3 levels where maybe using it internally, and then more or less what to expect. You can kind of read whatever is output by your evidence production system, and so that's a fairly simple case. You can make your own decision, and it's fine. Maybe if you want to present it publicly, do you have an expert witness that can actually explain the decision that's made based on the evidence to a reasonable level that it will be publicly trusted, or do you not have that and you actually want something that's publicly verifiable and as anyone can more or less understand, which is very, very non-trivial for things that are cryptographic or differential privacy and so on. And you have a lot of trade-offs. You have presently verifiability I've just talked about, and then an important other one is privacy. If you want to make decisions, how do you make sure that you're kind of giving enough information for decisions to be made without leaking private information? If it's payment systems, you want to know how a payment failed, but you might not want to reveal details of the payment. And so you have maybe zero knowledge proofs and things like that. But again, that means you have to take into account the pretty significant cost that can happen when you're dealing with that kind of stuff. And similarly, you have to verify everything. And there's some dilemmas as far as the more you hide, the harder it can be to verify. And then maybe you end up with something that computationally doesn't make too much sense as far as auditing. And that kind of goes into you want to have your framework needs to be sensible. You want to design evidence that fits your system, which is rarely the case at the moment. People kind of have something, it's broken, and then someone invents some auditing system for that. And suddenly they expect it to work, but then it maybe doesn't work so much. So that's getting to the end here. Just kind of going to sum up more or less. You've got models. How do you deal with a lot of constraints, unknown varying participants, computational costs, evolving systems, which isn't just a replayed game. Producing evidence, cryptographic evidence obviously makes a lot of sense. It's non-repudiation, so on. But what about non-cryptographic evidence, which might be also acceptable for some cases and might be more sensible, especially in the context of forms of evidence. If you want something that's kind of presentable and easy to verify. But also for privacy, how do you kind of disclose things? Well, there's a lot of methods for kind of disclosing things, but this goes back to the computational costs and the models, and there's a lot of interplay there. So that kind of should open the floor up for discussion, hopefully. So any questions, discussion, yeah, feel free.
Any questions? Well, let me start things off. It sounds like you're talking about a fairly general notion of evidence, so not cryptographic evidence.
Yep.
I wonder if you thought about other definitions of evidence that are a little more concrete, like legally justifiable or legally allowable, admissible evidence.
Yeah, so I think, that goes back to kind of the framework idea, where, and I think this even came up in the previous talk, where, you know, what actually constitutes kind of good evidence, and obviously from the law perspective, kind of the different countries have laws about what counts as admissible evidence or not. There's also kind of like, from a cryptographic point of view, certifying evidence, so, you know, maybe signing documents and so on. This came up in the previous talk where, you know, as you pointed out, like having a text document that doesn't have kind of like a cryptographic signature, you know, maybe doesn't make sense for a lot of people, but might be admissible for the legal system. This is more or less what we did on data access, where we looked at what was actually admissible as evidence from the kind of UK perspective as defined by laws on data access and data collection in the UK. And, you know, the thing for that was actually like just having a record that there was a request that makes sense was actually admissible. So that kind of works cryptographically. We have, you know, this big Merkle tree of requests and they accept that. But that not might work all the time. As far as like even less cryptographic things, it's a bit trickier to do. Maybe you have like, and it's not quite non-cryptographic, but things like, you know, do you want something differentially private? You know, depends what your framework is. But again, on the other hand, some systems are perfectly fine with cryptography, right? Like if you have a consensus mechanism that's kind of automated, like, you know, blockchain type stuff, they all admit cryptographic evidence like pretty happily. So it's mostly a framework thing.
So I did want to ask another thing, which was, you mentioned privacy here, and if we're putting all of our data or relevant data, logs, records, in a way that's also verifiable, the third thing that you have there, it'll seem like they're sort of contradictory. So how do you resolve making things available, but also keeping them from, you know, being disclosed when they shouldn't be? Yeah,
so that's kind of where maybe like more cryptography actually happens. You can do maybe zero knowledge proofs if something actually allows a sensible zero knowledge proof to happen. So, you know, if you're trying to show that you've followed some procedure that's arbitrarily defined, there's no way you can prove that in zero knowledge. If you're trying to prove that some data was accessed, then, you know, you're not going to show the data that was accessed, but you're going to show a proof that the data was accessed without revealing the data. So, you know, maybe if someone's filled in a form that says, like, I want access to this data and so on, that proves the data was accessed, but you're not actually revealing the private details of the actual in the data, which is probably the most sensible way to do it.
Any other questions? We have several minutes for questions. We should use them.
Maybe this is the post-ice cream coma, perhaps? There's a question.
Thank you for the talk. Is this working? All right. I really didn't get the Bayesian game theory part, how exactly you're trying to use a Bayesian game setting.
So the idea behind the Bayesian setting is that a Bayesian game is a game where you have incomplete information. So essentially you would more or less maybe know who the participants are, but you don't know if they're like honest, malicious, honest but curious, Byzantine, altruistic, whatever. And so instead of that, you might have like a probability distribution of what you expect that they might be. And so the idea there is that you can deal with not knowing how they are, but at the same time, if your system produces evidence, you will actually get a distribution that, like, you know, with evidence gets closer to reality and then allows people in the system to kind of like, for one, be incentivized to behave properly because they can't just, you know, hide behind uncertainty, but also for other people have a better distribution and maybe like change their behavior accordingly based on others. Or if you mean the machine part for computations, then that's more about kind of, you know, if doing actions in the systems, like executing a strategy, maybe making an audit or maybe trying to deviate, if that has a cost, then you want to be able to take that into account because obviously people don't do things for free. So if, let's say if verifying something is very expensive, you're obviously not incentivized to do it, and that means that it's probably easier to cheat. If verifying something is fairly cheap, and especially a lot cheaper than trying to cheat, then you're very disincentivized to cheat because you're more likely to get caught.
I was wondering if you considered a system where you have some kind of judge, like some kind of formal judge in a cryptographic sense that could decide when data should be disclosed and to whom. Does this fit in the framework of what you've been thinking about?
I think it's a good question. I think that's probably quite close to the ideal judge most people working in security have. The closest thing to that is probably an actual consensus mechanism, which obviously has assumptions as far as 51% honesty, whatever. I think it's quite. I don't think I would want to design a system with that in mind because that's not very realistic. I think if you want to have a judge in mind, it depends on the framework. If you're thinking about the legal sense, then probably your judge has never heard about cryptography. If you're thinking about trying to show things to computer scientists, then probably sure they'll know what to do if you give them an actual cryptographic proof. But that's really less general. I think again depends on what you're trying to deal with as far as the system goes. For dispute resolution, maybe especially things internally, maybe a company just running a big protocol inside them. They might have someone that's can be appointed as a technically savvy judge that can actually make a reasonable decision based on things like that. Or if you have something that can be more or less algorithmically evaluated, then maybe you can get some pretty reasonable approximation of that just by evaluating things automatically.
Well, if there are no further questions, let's thank the speaker again.